Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Before we get to the deck, my last discussion topic was protection, and you all gave me some great feedback that I want to address. B. Schroeder9979 said, I feel like faulting the spells that cantrip for encouraging bad play patterns is unfair. If a player uses them too early because they want the card, that's their play issue, not the fault of the card. I knew this was coming. For context, in my video I was critical of the card Shelter, which is an instant for 1 and a white that gives target creature you control protection from a color until end of turn. I think I'm going to stand by my point on this one. Shelter costs 2 instead of 1 because it has the line of text draw card tacked onto it, and I think considering the incentive this puts on a player in a game is important. In most decks, acting proactively is something you do at sorcery speed, so you must choose how much mana you want to leave up for interaction. If the mana of your protection spell is 1 instead of 2 like Shelter, that might mean that you're able to spend 1 additional mana being proactive if leaving up protection is important to you. Additionally, being a reactive spell, you may have to leave it up for a couple of turns before it's useful, so that 1 additional mana adds up over a few turns, and means you're more likely to cycle it, which isn't necessarily the wrong play. In fact, it's one of the options that playing a more expensive spell has given you. All that being said, I do agree that Shelter is a powerful card. It is card neutral in white, which really needs that sometimes, but avoiding the pitfall of playing it too early doesn't make it cost less mana, which is the concession you make when you put this into your deck over something cheaper. Thank you very much for your comment. Bill, aka Too Much Do, said, I think Renegade's Getaway is not so bad. The card says target permanent gains indestructible, so it could potentially save your Tortured Existence or Ashnod's Altar while comboing in mono black decks, and leaves a body behind, which could be sacrificed to Ashnod's Altar to protect a key creature from an edict. I completely glossed over both of those points in my video. I think I just saw 3 mana and kind of checked out, but that's a great catch. I've been seeing both Tortured Existence and Ashnod's Altar put in more and more work lately, and those decks are ones that can really use a spare 1/1 to the fullest. Thank you, Bill. Thank you to everyone else that responded too. I wish I could include everyone in the video, but I'm betting that this is going to be a long one, so let's get started. I want to talk about my current favorite competitive deck, one that I've put a lot of work into, Thraben Watcher. Thraben Watcher is a 2/2 angel for 2 white, with flying, vigilance, and other non-token creatures you control get +1/+1 and have vigilance. I realize that Thraben Watcher isn't exactly the first deck that you'd reach for if you were considering a deck for competitive, so I'd like to give a little background as to how I got here. I love to see how simple keywords can be exploited, so without knowing that they were part of a cycle, I built Jubilant Skybonder, a Cares About Flying deck, and Cunning Nightbonder, a Flash Tribal deck. Then one time, I think while we were streaming together, Brad from the PDH Pod podcast pointed out that I played multiple commanders from the Bonder cycle, so I hurried and looked up what the other Bonders did so I didn't look like an idiot, and set myself a goal to build all 5 of them. My conclusion from doing this is that Cunning Nightbonder is incredibly fun, Jubilant Skybonder gets broken when you just play Empyrean Eagle instead. Sonorous Howlbonder and Proud Wildbonder aren't super fun because they basically give you unblockable, which removes the fun of interacting in combat, but Alert Heedbonder was special. It's a 3 mana 2/4 with Vigilance that gains you life for each creature you control with Vigilance, but what it really did was win. A lot. I won my first 5 casual games and it didn't feel close, so I quickly started to feel bad playing it as a casual commander. It's actually the reason that I go every other week with casual and competitive games on my stream, because I wanted to see how good it was in a competitive pod, and it kept up pretty well. It did this by playing a Voltron strategy where you're encouraged to go wide and decentralize your threats, so it's less soft to removal than other Voltron strategies. Every creature in the 99 had Vigilance, and almost all of them had Flying, so the deck became difficult to attack very quickly, and even if someone was able to get through, Alert Heedbonder's considerable life gain allowed you to choose your battles. Life gain also gave you allies. Any deck playing pingers could almost be ignored completely, so you could kill the other players with the assistance of the pinger deck, which left it in an advantageous position. The deck wasn't perfect though, so I started to wonder if there was a commander that plays with the same synergies. The things I wanted to carry forward were Vigilance's ability to allow you to be proactive while giving you a wall that incentivizes your opponents to attack elsewhere. Vigilance works well with Convoke or tap as a cost like Ramosian Rally, making them even more free. A strong life gain package that beat the pinger meta, and a decentralized plan. The weaknesses of the deck were that it wasn't very fast, so much so that if there wasn't another deck pinging other players, it really suffered. And being forced to play only creatures that have Vigilance is a huge deck building restriction that makes you scrape the bottom of the barrel and play really bad cards. Because of that last point, I started to search for commanders that gave other creatures vigilance or untapped them. What I found were a few that were too restrictive like Embodiment of Insight and Aven Wind Guide, but I also found some that were worth considering. Loyal Unicorn is a 3/4 for 4 with Vigilance and Lieutenant, which means it only works if you control your commander, which is always unless it's removed before the ability resolves. The effect of the ability is, at the beginning of combat on your turn, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to creatures you control this turn. Other creatures you control gain Vigilance until end of turn. This gave Vigilance like I was looking for, so at the cost of no longer being able to run green cards, the creature package would be a lot more inclusive, and the deck could attack without the fear of losing creatures to blockers, so it was a strong contender. Tori Davenant, Fury Rider, is a 3/3 for 1 red-red-white, with Vigilance, Trample, and, whenever this attacks, all other attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Other red creatures you control gain Trample until end of turn. Untap each other white attacking creature you control. When you compare this to Loyal Unicorn, if you're looking to keep your creatures untapped, the creature base must remain white, but you get all of the hybrid creatures as well, which generally suck, so I don't consider that much of a boon. The commander also has red-red in its cost, which is bad because I want to fill this deck with a lot of plains and only splash red for non-creature spells. It does give your creatures +1/+1 when you're attacking, but only if you attack with your commander as well, which is a huge drawback that Loyal Unicorn doesn't suffer from. Lulu, Loyal Holophant, is a 3/2 for 3 and a white with flying and, at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each tapped creature you control, then untap them, and choose a background. I'm actually not sure that I made the right choice not choosing Lulu, but I'll explain my reasoning. Untapping your creatures is very different from Vigilance. It means that you can't play your spells for free using your creatures while you are attacking, because they're not untapped until the end of your turn. And if Lulu is removed, that may never happen, which leaves you extremely vulnerable. That and the snowballing nature of adding counters to your creatures every turn makes Lulu a lightning rod for removal because the best time to deal with it is almost always immediately. It does have the benefit of allowing you to splash any color you'd like by adding a background of that color, and there are some appealing options, but they further incentivize others to kill Lulu. And finally, there was Thraben Watcher. When compared to Lulu, Thraben Watcher has an immediate impact on attacks you make on the turn that it comes out, so it's a little better than Lulu on the turn that it comes out, but it doesn't have the same potential to snowball as Lulu does, which I actually kind of like that it doesn't. If a player chooses not to kill Thraben Watcher until after it attacks, the extra damage can be stopped by removing it, so the only thing killing it before attacks does is make you tap your creatures to attack, which is a lot easier to agree to for an opponent. After all, if I attack another opponent, they would get to save their removal while our shared opponent suffers. That means you can make it one player's problem at a time, whereas Lulu is everyone's problem immediately, because they know that they'll have to deal with the creatures with all the counters eventually. The biggest thing that Thraben Watcher gives up, when compared to the other commanders that I was considering, is an incentive to play tokens. Tokens are one of White's best ways to generate advantage, but I figured that I was probably fine because I reasoned that a deck would be stronger if it focused on the creatures with the best abilities it had access to, rather than generating vanilla creatures. So now I have a commander, and I'd like to start by adding a lot of creatures. I ended up on 41 total. First, we have some creatures dedicated to protecting our other creatures. Benevolent Bodyguard is a 1/1 for a white with Sacrifice Benevolent Bodyguard. Target creature gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Not costing mana to activate means we can tap out, while keeping Thraben Watcher or our other threats safe from a wide variety of removal, so it's an auto include. Shieldmate fulfills a similar role. It's a 1/1 for a white with Sacrifice Shieldmate. Target creature gets +0/+4 until end of turn. While it's not close to being as good as Benevolent Bodyguard, there's a lot of removal that cares about toughness, and situations in combat where sacrificing this 1-mana creature can save something worth far more. Most importantly, both of these get Thraben Watcher out of the range of popular board wipes like Fiery Cannonade, Breath Weapon, and Evenkar's Justice. Shieldmate even helps with Drown in Sorrow and Arms of Hadar, which Benevolent Bodyguard doesn't do. That's super important because Thraben Watcher pushes any 2 toughness creature to 3 toughness, which means we don't get wiped out by board wipes. That actually motivates a lot of the card choices in the deck. If you don't shore up that weakness, it's possible to be incidentally sent back to the Stone Age whenever someone plays their Minisweeper. Some notable exclusions in the protection package are Obsidian and Crimson Acolyte. These are a pretty recent cut. They help protect from the colors of board wipes, red and black, but I try not to play silver bullets like these. When I played them, I had some games where they were awesome, some where they did nothing, and some where red and black decks felt so threatened by these that they focused me down just for playing it, because it removed their ability to block. I played in a pretty board wipe heavy meta, and still cut these for more generically good cards. Blessed Hippogriff is a 2/3 for 3 and a white with flying, and whenever Blessed Hippogriff attacks, target attacking creature without flying gains flying until end of turn. But more importantly, it has an adventure half, Tyr's Blessing, that's an instant for a white that gives a creature indestructible until end of turn. While you have to leave up mana to protect your creature with this, it is both a protection spell and a creature, so it's right on plan. The creature half is a little lackluster, but giving another creature flying can really come in handy. Field Surgeon is a 1/1 for 1 and a white with tap an untapped creature you control. Prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. Thraben Watcher feels like it was built to take advantage of this card. It's hard to describe just how flexible this card is. It works against damage-based board wipes and makes combat a nightmare for your opponents. One of my favorite things to do is stack block something, make sure to ask how your opponent orders their blockers after blocks are declared, and then prevent damage on the first blocker. Heliod's Pilgrim is a 1/2 for 2 and a white with, when Heliod's Pilgrim enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an aura card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This deck plays 3 auras that have flash and give a creature protection. We'll talk about those more later on, but the fact that the 1/2 body doesn't need to stay in play for the protection to work because it's coming from another card means that the body is pretty disposable, which is a good thing. Veteran Armorer is a 2/2 for 1 and a white with, other creatures you control get +0/+1. Having this and Thraben Watcher puts both of them out of the range of the 2 damage sweepers, and the rest of your board getting a constant +1/+2 really gives you an edge in combat. With a pump that large, every inconsequential body really starts to matter and trade up in combat. Additionally, we already know that the deck is going to be optimized to maximize the effectiveness of having Anthems, so having half of one on a 2-mana creature is perfect. So next, I'd like to dive into other creature Anthems in the deck. Steadfast Unicorn is a 1/2 for a white with 3 and a white. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Activate only during your turn. There are multiple creatures in the deck like this that have an Anthem on an activated ability, and this one is my favorite. What makes it the best is that its ability is the cheapest. The other ones cost 5 to activate. Reducing the cost makes activating multiple times in a turn a lot more doable. It also provides vigilance, which makes the deck less reliant on the commander. It can only be activated on your turn, but that's not much of a concern because I much prefer to use these aggressively. Seagate Banneret is a 1/2 for a white with 4 and a white. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Like Steadfast Unicorn, it also has 2 base toughness, which I've already mentioned being important when it comes to sweepers in the format. Unlike Steadfast Unicorn, it can be activated on other players' turns, but that doesn't come up often. You mostly want to activate it when you're attacking. We still run it though, because the effect is very good and the deck needs mana sinks. Cliffside Lookout is almost the same as Seagate Banneret, but it has 1 less toughness. This demonstrates how badly we want this effect. Ambush Paratrooper is the last version of this that I included. It's a 1/2 for 1 and a white, with flash, flying, and the same ability. Having flash allows the deck to play at instant speed, which is much needed so that you can hold up protection and interaction, and the flying helps you push damage. We don't just want anything with that ability though. One notable exclusion is Charismatic Vanguard. It's excluded because it's difficult to attack with on the ground without losing it, and the 3 mana cost means you're not able to activate it right away like you can do with the others pretty easily. Rock's Veteran fulfills a similar role. It's a 2/4 for 3 and a white with Battlecry, which gives your other creatures +1/+0 when it attacks. And it has, whenever it attacks, it also taps a creature an opponent controls. It only gives a buff to the attack of your creatures, and only when it's attacking, but it really feels like having a redundant commander a lot of the time. In fact, if I have to make the choice between playing my commander and this, I almost always choose to play this first, because it's even less of a removal magnet, and has 4 toughness. Plus when I play Thraben Watcher after this, getting both buffs and having a 3/5 blocker is a really good position to be in, especially when you consider that you get those benefits turn after turn. All of that is without even considering that this taps a creature when it attacks, and unlike Greatsword of Tyr, it can tap any creature, not just one the defending player controls, which can really open up attacks. Most abilities that trigger on attack are inconsistent because you can't always attack, but removing 1 blocker and having high toughness, this has not been an issue for me. Loxodon Partisan is Rock's Veteran's stupid older brother. It costs 1 more mana than Rock's Veteran, has an additional power, and doesn't have an ability other than Battlecry. There are days where I think I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel a little bit on this one, but the deck benefits from the free attack buff enough that I keep it in. A notable exclusion from the attacking creature anthems is Tawcrop Elite. It's a 2/2 for 3 and a white with flying, and when it attacks, you may exert it to give your other creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. While Thraben Watcher is out, this is incredible. It gives itself a buff, so it attacks as a 4/4, but it really puts a target on Thraben Watcher's back. If Thraben Watcher is removed, the battlecry creatures can still at least work consistently, which is actually what happened in my last video. Thraben Watcher was removed, but Rock's Veteran did a great job of standing in its place. Supply Runners is a 2/2 for 4 and a white with, when Supply Runners enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. There are many creatures that give a temporary buff when they enter the battlefield, but since this isn't a flicker deck, we're only looking for the cream of the crop, so the only ETB anthem that makes it in the list gives a more permanent buff using counters. One exception is Eagles of the North, which is a 3/3 for 5 and a white with flying, and when Eagles of the North enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+0 and first strike until end of turn, and plane cycling. The cheap plane cycling really mitigates the games where this would be bad, and when you actually get to play it, the body is actually really nice, the additional attack is great, and because no other card in the deck says first strike, its ability is as helpful as it could be. The first strike can be relevant because it moves up the toughness required to trade with your creature, but it hasn't come up that often. So that puts us at 8.5 anthems on creatures, in addition to Thraben Watcher, without even looking at the spells. With all of these anthems, it should be very clear that the more mana we can generate, and the more bodies we can play, the better off we'll be, so creatures that replace themselves are premium in this deck. Thraben Inspector is a 1/2 for a white with, when Thraben Inspector enters the battlefield, investigate. The cost of playing this and then activating the clue is on rate at 3 mana total, but it's really nice that it can be spread out over 2 turns. Spirited Companion is a 1/1 for 1 and a white with, when Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. It violates our guideline of having at least 2 toughness to avoid board wipes, but it replaces itself relatively efficiently, so it gets a pass. Roving Harper is a 2/2 for 2 and a white with, when Roving Harper enters the battlefield, draw a card. This is a simple card doing a simple but necessary job. It's important to prepare and plan for your commander to be removed often, so I don't like doing this with the power and toughness of everything, but if you consider if Thraben Watcher is out, this is a 3/3 with Vigilance for 3 mana, before you consider the draw card, which really helps make the deck consistent. Search Party Captain is a 2/2 for 3 and a white with, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature you attacked with this turn, and when Search Party Captain enters the battlefield, draw a card. The earliest you can play this is turn 3, so it's very similar to Roving Harper in your opening hand, but later on, it's a cantripping 2/2 for 1 mana a lot of the time. A 3/3 with Thraben Watcher. Inspiring Overseer is a 2/1 for 2 and a white with flying, and when Inspiring Overseer enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This notably doesn't have 2 toughness, so it dies to 2 damage board wipes, even with Thraben Watcher, but it replacing itself more than makes up for it. The 1 life is negligible, but the flying and 2 power on the other hand allows you to push through a lot of damage. Priest of Ancient Lore is a 2/1 for 2 and a white with, when Priest of Ancient Lore enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Without the flying that Inspiring Overseer has, I actually consider this worse than my baseline, which is Roving Harper. I would rather have 1 additional toughness than 1 life. It's just really hard to attack profitably with such a low toughness. Skyscanner is a 1/1 for 3 with flying and, when Skyscanner enters the battlefield, draw a card. It has flying, which helps push damage and block, even if it's a bad rate without Thraben Watcher being in play. The deck really is just hungry for creatures with this effect, and would play more that said draw a card if it could. Skittering Surveyor is a 1/2 for 3 with, when Skittering Surveyor enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Like I mentioned with Skyscanner, the deck is very hungry for bodies that replace themselves in your hand. With 36 lands in the deck, on turn 4, if you've drawn no additional cards, you have about a 60% chance of being able to play a 4th land. That number doesn't consider the fact that you'll probably mulligan away any unplayable hands, but I think you get my point, that if we don't plan for it, we may not hit our land drops consistently, and on any turn that we would have missed our land, and can go get one with one of these fetchers, that's only a net loss of 2 mana that turn, and the land is going to pay dividends over the course of the game, which makes these pretty good actually. Pilgrim of the Ages is a 2/1 for 2 and a white with, when Pilgrim of the Ages enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, and 6. Return Pilgrim of the Ages from your graveyard to your hand. This is one of those non-flying spirits that always trip me up. Being on the ground and only having 1 base toughness means that this creature's job is mostly to trade for value. Its 6 mana ability rarely comes up because it's so expensive, but it's nice to have in the extreme late game. By including this and other cantripping creatures, we've made hitting land drops a priority, so we should have the mana to pay for it eventually. Pilgrim's Eye is a 1/1 for 3 with flying, and when Pilgrim's Eye enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Again, this only has 1 toughness, but the incidental flying on creatures like this gives the deck a lot of reach on clogged boards, especially since our opponent's flyers usually have less power and toughness. I've done a lot of testing without these land fetchers, or the creatures that draw a card, and the amount of consistency that these add is tangible. There are a few notable exclusions that are pretty similar though. Farfinder's Vigilance is mostly redundant, and its 1/1 body is bad, but I've been tempted to cut a land for this. Scouting Hawk puts a land into play, and has flying, but hasn't been consistent for me. Additionally, it puts the land into play tapped, so you don't get the 1 mana back the same turn like you do the ones that put the land into your hand. Core Cartographer has a 2/2 body and consistently puts the land into play, tapped. I still would rather have the land put into my hand, and 4 mana is just too much. Palace Sentinels is a 2/4 for 3 and a white with, when Palace Sentinels enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. One of the benefits of Vigilance we haven't spoken about is that it allows us to defend the Monarch and initiative extremely well. You don't want to expend too many resources defending it, but just by the merit of having large untapped creatures, taking it from us isn't going to be an option for most of the table. What's more important than holding the Monarch is retaking it. The deck plays a considerable number of flyers, including the commander, so it also excels at this. In my experience, even if you have to trade it back and forth with people for a short time, the consistent advantage that the Monarch provides helps us draw into interaction and additional blockers better than most other decks, so you usually come out on top in situations like that. Staunch Throne Guard is a 2/5 for 5 with Vigilance, and when Staunch Throne Guard enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Costing an extra mana for mostly the same effect as Palace Sentinels definitely makes it worse, but we want the Monarch badly enough that we're happy to at least have access to multiple cards with it. That's one thing that we miss out on by being a monocolored deck. Goliath Paladin is a 3/6 for 4 and a white with Vigilance, and when Goliath Paladin enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. When you compare the initiative to the Monarch, the initiative granting its benefits as soon as you get it makes it easier to find a spot to play it, which is usually when you're going to miss a land drop. The additional benefit of still progressing you through the Undercity if you've already taken the initiative from an opponent also makes a huge difference when you compare it to the Monarch. The body on this is also notable. 3/6 is huge, and it becomes a 4/7 with Thraben Watcher in play. Palace Sentinels and Staunch Throne Guard also become great attackers and blockers that make holding and retaking the initiative in Monarch profitable. I also did some testing without these effects to focus on being more aggressive. I was partially hoping that I could take advantage of other players playing these effects for me, but I drew too much attention early on and had less ability to rebuild, so I re-added them to the deck. The entire rest of our creature base is dedicated to staying alive, and I mentioned earlier when I was switching off of Alert Heedmonder that I wanted to have a strong life gain package, so I'd like to touch on those first. Soul Warden is a 1/1 for a white with, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life, and Soul's Attendant, which is identical. These triggering off of other players' creatures means that they can gain upward of 20 life if they go unchecked. Suture Priest is a 1/1 for 1 and a white with, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain 1 life, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose a life. I've done some testing with cards that only gain you life when your own creatures enter the battlefield, and not playing tokens means we're not great at triggering it ourselves, so I don't run them. This means that the primary reason we're running this is to make our opponents lose life. An interesting thing that Soul's Warden, Soul's Attendant, and Suture Priest all do is prevent some combos that need a creature to enter and leave the battlefield, like ones that use Impact Tremors or Falconwrath Noble. Healer's Hawk is a 1/1 for a white with flying and lifelink. With Thraben Watcher's buff, lifelink creatures can put in a lot of work, enough to outpace most pinger decks at least. Flying works perfectly with this to make sure that it can attack every turn, so much so that every lifelinker in the deck has flying. Sungrace Pegasus is a 1/2 for 1 and a white with flying and lifelink as well. While Healer's Hawk is more efficient, playing with Sungrace Pegasus has really reinforced how important it is to have 2 toughness in this deck. I've won many games off of this card. Skycrier is a 1/1 for 1 and a white with flying, lifelink, and 3 and a white. You and target opponent each draw a card. This only having 1 toughness is disappointing, but it still comes down early and starts gaining you life like the other 2 lifelinkers. I'm not in a hurry to activate its ability, but later on, it's not uncommon for a player to be so non-threatening to you, or for them to be about to die, so that you can activate this profitably. Stepping away from life gain, but sticking with staying alive, Kami of False Hope is a 1/1 for a white with Sacrifice Kami of False Hope. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. It doesn't cost mana to activate, which is awesome, and keeping you alive is good, but this also helps hold the Monarch in the initiative. This also shores up a weakness that the deck has. The life gain is great, but commander damage can sneak up on you. A notable exclusion from the life gain package is Syndic of Tithes and Basilica Guards, which both have Extort. The deck is already pretty mana hungry, so I think that if I were to expand the life gain package, it would be with something else with lifelink, like Seraph of Dawn or Disciple of the Sun, which I've also found to be too expensive. The rest of the creatures in the deck are for interacting with your opponent. Beladar Cub, Kami of Ancient Law, Keening Apparition, and Ranam Unicorn are all 2/2s for 1 and a white, with Sacrifice this, destroy target enchantment. I know these look weird, and I'm not 100% sure that I'm right that they're good, but they have been performing for me. White isn't great at a lot of things, but it can really hate on enchantments, and I like playing to my strengths. Their abilities don't cost mana, so you're given a lot of control over when you use them. I prefer to keep them in play as long as possible, but when you have to use them to chump block, or someone targets them with removal, being able to slow down someone playing an enchantment for no additional cost feels good. It makes these really easy to be aggressive with. There's also situations where one of your opponents knows that the other player is waiting to go off with something like Freed from the Real or Ophidian Eye, because your creature's in play, and it becomes in their best interest to not remove it. The opposite may be true if their enchantment is already in play though. If you're not motivated to remove it yourself, like when you have a Soul's Attendant in play, and an opponent has Impact Tremors in play, another opponent may want to point removal at your creature to motivate you to remove the enchantment, which is a 2-for-1 anyway. The situation where this isn't good is when there's no enchantments at all, but that just hasn't been the case for me, with all the backgrounds running around. Soltari Visionary is a 2/2 for 1 white with Shadow, and whenever Soltari Visionary deals damage to a player, destroy target enchantment that player controls. This card is able to keep certain decks pretty far behind if they rely on enchantments, but truth be told, this card has been on the chopping block for a while, because like I mentioned earlier, I try to avoid playing silver bullets. If the threat at the table doesn't use enchantments, it doesn't feel optimal. What keeps it in the deck is that it has Shadow, so it can push through damage very easily, and that's a decently high floor. Another negative is that it can't block creatures that don't have Shadow. I think it's funny that this getting Vigilance from Thraben Watcher makes it a great blocker for creatures opponents have with Shadow. More seriously though, that just means that this is the first thing that I tapped when I have to pay a cost with Convoke. Cathar Commando is a 3/1 for 1 and a white with Flash, and 1 and sacrifice Cathar Commando. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. With all that other enchantment hate, I try to save this for artifacts. The Flash is awesome because it lets the deck play more at instant speed, but it's not great as a surprise blocker most of the time, because with 1 toughness, it dies to almost anything. You also really want to use its ability, so trading it for a random attacker isn't super appealing. For that same reason, I have a hard time attacking with it unless I have a combat trick, in which case, the high power for this comes in handy. Guardian Naga is a 5/6 for 5 white with Vigilance, and, as long as it's your turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to Guardian Naga. It also has an adventure half that's an instant that says, exile target artifact or enchantment. You definitely play this for the Banishing Coil half. Between this and Cathar Commando, these are the deck's only ways of dealing with artifacts. If we look at other spells that remove artifacts at instant speed in white, they do provide other utility, but 3's on rate, it exiles, and it can target enchantments to boot. So the card is pretty good before you even consider the creature that it comes with, which is the largest creature in our deck. I love that it has Vigilance, and even without Thraben Watcher, its ability means that you can attack with it with very little risk. And like I mentioned, the deck makes hitting lands a priority, so 7 mana is consistently attainable. That's all of the creatures, so I want to touch on a few last notable exclusions before we move on. I'm not playing Standard Bearer and Coalition Honor Guard because the deck is already so stacked against enchantments. I know that these work on more than just enchantments, but many of the beneficial spells that target can only target your own creatures anyway, such as Ghostly Flicker, and if an opponent is able to do that, they now have a Flag Bearer protecting them. I also don't like playing something that makes the next order of business for the table to remove it. Standard Bearer's body is also pretty terrible. The last creatures I want to talk about are ones with Convoke, like Martyr's Soul, Halo Hopper, and Ladev Guardian. I've highlighted these 3 because they're the cheapest. It seems like anything higher than 4 mana made hands too awkward. What I found with these was just that the deck wasn't capable of going fast enough to make playing cards that don't generate some kind of value worth it. Next, let's talk about enchantments. Benevolent Blessing is an aura for 1 and a white with Flash, and As Benevolent Blessing enters the battlefield, choose a color. And enchanted creature has protection from the chosen color. This effect doesn't remove auras and equipment you control that are already attached to it. This is my default Heliod's Pilgrim tutor. All 3 of the enchantments in this deck are like this. They all have flash, give a creature protection from a color, and can be used on your opponent's creatures, so they're pretty versatile. The deck is removal light, so anything we can do to mess up our opponents goes a long way. Chomino's Blessing is an aura for white with flash, and as Chomino's Blessing enters the battlefield, choose a color, and enchanted creature has protection from the chosen color. This effect doesn't remove Chomino's Blessing. So like I said, it's very similar to Benevolent Blessing. The mana cost is just more color intensive, and the final ability that prevents it from removing itself also keeps anything you control attached to it on Benevolent Blessing, so this is worse all around, but still an extremely good spell. Being enchantments, both of these auras also continue to give protection to your creature, which can turn it into a huge threat for 1 or 2 of your opponents that it has protection from their color. Ward of Lights is an aura for white that has, you may cast Ward of Lights as though it had flash. If you cast it any time a sorcery couldn't have been cast, the controller of the permanent it becomes sacrifices it at the beginning of the next cleanup step. And, as Ward of Lights enters the battlefield, choose a color. And, enchanted creature has protection from the chosen color. This effect doesn't remove Ward of Lights. I've never played this at sorcery speed, although I can imagine a scenario where you're doing it for the unblockable. It sacrificing itself if you play it at instant speed doesn't actually feel terrible. It makes it easier to justify using it to fizzle a spell targeting an opponent's creature, and even works better at doing it, because sometimes protecting their creature with Benevolent Blessing or Chomino's Blessing has the side effect of making that target untouchable to some players as long as it's enchanted, so sacrificing itself can be a benefit. Even if you play this on your own creature though, it still does the job of a protection spell perfectly fine. Some notable exclusions for enchantments are Spectral Grasp and Martial Impetus. I tested these out and found that if my opponent didn't spend a resource removing the enchantment, their first thought in deciding who to attack would be how to still send something my way, and the wider a deck goes, the better it is at doing that. There are also Sorcery Speed, which I really hate in my removal. That wraps up enchantments, so speaking of hating sorcery speed things, let's talk about the one sorcery in the deck, Marshalling Cry. It's 1 white with creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. It also has cycling for 2 and flashback for 3 and a white. I almost always cycle this away when I have spare mana, so my only sorcery is actually an instant in disguise. The vigilance can be redundant, but it's acted as a replacement Thraben Watcher pretty often. This is also good because 4 mana for the Anthem out of the graveyard is as good as Steadfast Unicorn's ability, which is our most efficient Anthem on a creature, so this card feels like all upside. Some notable exclusions from the sorceries are Recommission and Return Triumphant. In the testing I've done with these, I found that I would rather have a cheap creature that I don't have to wait to get into the graveyard. That was the one sorcery in the deck, so let's move on to instants. Ramosian Rally is 3 and a white for an instant with, if you control a plains, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than pay the spell's mana cost, and creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is our only other non-creature anthem other than Marshalling Cry, and like all other anthems, it takes you out of the range of most sweepers, can close out a game, and can make combat more profitable. And this allows you to keep that ability up while tapping out, because its alternative cost makes it basically free. Ephemeral Shields is 1 and a white for an instant with Convoke, and target creature gains indestructible until end of turn. I mentioned earlier that I cut all of the creatures with Convoke because they make you threatening too early. Reactive instants don't have that issue. Indestructible isn't even a very good keyword, but it's still worth it. Aerial Boost is 1 and a white for an instant with Convoke, and target creature gets +2/+2 and gains flying until end of turn. The pump that this card gives is worse than the indestructible Ephemeral Shields gives for anything that doesn't care about the creature's toughness, but again, I value the tempo that this gives, discreetly, pretty highly. It allows you to tap out while staying safe from board wipes, and most importantly, it allows you to attack through larger creatures and break someone's defense sometimes. Orum's Cure is 1 and a white for an instant with, if you control a plains, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than play the spell's mana cost, and prevent the next 4 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. This is the last free spell in the deck, and it's probably the worst. It's a little disappointing that it only targets creatures, so it doesn't help hold the Monarch in the initiative in that way, but like Aerial Boost, it allows you to take greater risks in combat, and defends you from some removal spells for free. Stave Off is a white for an instant with, target creature gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Like our enchantments, this can target any creature, so it pulls double duty by acting as interaction in a pinch. This and the adventure half of Blessed Hippogriff are the only 1-mana protection spells in the deck, which makes this extra valuable. Flicker of Fate is 1 and a white for an instant with exile target creature or enchantment, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. The deck has 15 creatures that have effects when they enter the battlefield, so the deck is able to get full value out of the flicker, so the next logical question would be why the deck isn't playing something like Ephemerate. Ephemerate was actually in the deck to begin with, but the deck has so much protection, I eventually concluded that if I'm going to spend mana on a protection spell, I need it to double as interaction as often as possible, which Ephemerate doesn't do. It's worth mentioning that this can also target enchantments, but this deck doesn't take advantage of that very well. Otherworldly Journey is 1 and a white for an instant with exile target creature. At the beginning of the next end step, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. This being a slow flicker that can target opponent's creatures can help remove blockers for a turn, stop an attacker, or stop an opponent from targeting their own creature. It has some awkward interactions, like not really helping with board wipes, but the +1/+1 counter and versatility makes it worth it. The ceiling on flickers is always high. Hobbit Sting is 1 and a white for an instant with Hobbit Sting deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of creatures you control, plus the number of foods you control. The deck desperately needs instant speed removal, because with so few removal spells, they need to be used as a last resort, and we really don't want to have to pay 3 for the removal, so I've found that relying on having a decent creature count is fine with this. Swift Response is 1 and a white for an instant with Destroy Target Tapped Creature. Only working on tapped creatures is a pretty big drawback, but it's the efficient removal that white gets access to at instant speed, so this is playing to our strengths the best we can again. Cut Short is 2 and a white for an instant with Convoke, and destroy target planeswalker that was activated this turn, or tapped creature. Like Swift Response, this only destroys tapped creatures. The more spells we run that share a condition for being playable like these two, the worse they get, which is why we only run the 2. That's not to say that we're iffy about running Cut Short. It having Convoke means that it's a free removal spell a lot of the time, which is awesome. The notable exclusions from the removal package are Expel, which was excluded because we already have 2 removal spells that only target tapped creatures, Charge of the Mites, because for 3 mana we can get less conditional removal, Afterlife, because it makes a flyer, which can be awkward for this deck, and Crib Swap, which is by far the closest thing to being in the deck. It exiles, which gets around some protection spells, prevents recursion, and the creature it gives the opponent doesn't have flying, so it's not as much of an issue as it is on Afterlife. But 3 mana is just a lot of mana to hold up in this deck. Prismatic Strands is 2 and a white for an instant with Prevent all damage that sources of the color of your choice would deal this turn, and Flashback, tap an untapped white creature you control. This spell is so versatile. It protects us from damage-based board wipes, and can act as a one-sided board wipe in combat if the opponent's creatures are a different color than ours. It can even stop some damage-based combos. The flashback cost of tapping a creature is again free. The most difficult part of using it is getting it into the graveyard in the first place. Safe Passage is 2 and a white for an instant with Prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control this turn. 3 mana is steep, but with a combat-focused deck like this, our board progresses pretty linearly. Our opponents can predict pretty accurately how much damage we'll be able to deal, and can formulate a plan to beat us. Fogs completely change that math in our favor, so to me, it's a matter of which ones go in the deck, and this stopping non-combat damage in addition to being a one-sided board wipe in combat secures its spot. Dawn Charm is 1 and a white for an instant with Choose 1. Prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn, regenerate target creature, or counter target spell that targets you. Like Safe Passage, this is a matter of choosing your fogs. Dawn Charm stopping fireballs and doubling as a decently costed protection spell all add up to this card consistently putting in work. That's it for the instants, so next up is the artifacts. Great Sword of Tyr is an equipment for 1 and a white with whenever an equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it and tap up to 1 target creature defending player controls, and equip for a white. The counters accumulating on this turn after turn add up incredibly quickly, and being able to tap a creature repeatedly should not be underestimated. Most players will have a small number of large creatures and a fair number of chump blockers. Our deck goes wide enough that the chump blockers aren't as much of an issue, and with tapping down their best blocker, I felt like this has helped me run away with the game many times. It's so good that we play Armory of Iroas. Armory of Iroas is an equipment for 2, with whenever equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and equip for 2. The equipability costs 1 more to activate than Great Sword of Tyr, and it doesn't tap a creature, but we play it because we want the effect so badly. The deck generates a lot of advantage by making insignificant bodies into actual threats. The Anthems, including the Commander, are the first way that we pump our creatures without opening ourselves up to a 2-for-1, and these are the second, because they can be re-equipped. By default, these equipments are best put on something other than Thraben Watcher, so we don't increase the incentive to kill it, but it still ends up on Thraben Watcher fairly often, and that makes killing with Commander damage a real option. Trailblazer's Torch is an equipment for 4, with, when Trailblazer's Torch enters the battlefield, you take the initiative, and, whenever equipped creature becomes blocked, it deals 2 damage to each creature blocking it, and equipped for 1. This is our last equipment, and before getting in a lot of reps with it, I really didn't like Trailblazer's Torch, but it's won me over. 4 mana is a lot, but the deck takes advantage of the initiative so well that it's easy to find a turn to play it. What I'm most surprised about, though, is that because its equip cost is so cheap, it gets equipped quickly and makes retaking the initiative a lot easier. I like to equip this to creatures on the ground with a high attack and low toughness like Cathar Commando. If Thraben Watcher is out, you have a 4/2 that deals 2 damage to each creature blocking it, so to block it profitably, your creature would need to have 7 toughness, and stack blocking with creatures less than 3 toughness doesn't help. Bonder's Ornament is 3, and has tap, add 1 mana of any color, and 4 in tap, each player who controls a permanent named Bonder's Ornament draws a card. The deck doesn't run very many mana rocks because the spells in it are pretty inexpensive, and it doesn't draw enough cards that it's guaranteed to make land drops often enough to justify cutting lands for those rocks. An exception is made for Bonder's Ornament because we really need the mana sink in the late game, and the deck prioritizes card advantage pretty highly. Magnifying Glass is 3 and has tap, add a colorless mana, and 4 in tap, investigate. When you compare this to Bonder's Ornament, Magnifying Glass costs 2 more to draw a card, but the deck does need the effect badly enough to play both. I see this like having the Monarch that you have to pay for, which really isn't that hard in the late game, and consistently having this effect by putting 2 of them in the deck wins you a lot of 1 versus 1s. That's it for the artifacts, so let's talk about the lands. The deck is running 36 lands total, 10 spells that cantrip if you include the ones that give you the Monarch, 6 that tutor for a land if you include the initiative, and 2 mana rocks. If we only count cantripping as half caring about making a land drop, there are 49 cards in the deck that help with mana generation, which is just a fun fact, but I think that it backs up what I've been saying about the consistency of the deck. There are games that we flood out though, so I've included the cycling lands. Secluded Steppe, which enters tapped, makes a white and can be cycled for a white. Drifting Meadow, which enters tapped, makes a white and can be cycled for 2. And Desert of the True, which enters tapped, makes a white and can be cycled for 1 and a white. Because they're the only tapped lands, it's pretty easy to find a place to play these that doesn't affect your tempo very much. What they really do is add a lot of consistency. 36 is a lot of lands for a competitive deck, which helps us hit lands early before you can start playing your cantrips or land tutors, but once you can, these can be cycled. Opal Palace makes it colorless and has 1 in tap. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. If you spend this mana to cast your commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone this game. This puts Thraben Watcher out of the range of the 2 damage sweepers the first time you cast it, and it increases your chances of eliminating someone using commander damage. All of that on an untapped land is an auto-include in this format, and it's especially good in Thraben Watcher. Forge of Heroes makes it colorless and has tap, choose target commander that entered the battlefield this turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature, and a loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker. This isn't as good as Opal Palace because it doesn't scale, and the counter has to be put on the creature rather than just entering with it, but getting 3 toughness on Thraben Watcher is really important. This isn't strictly worse than Opal Palace though. I have been able to flicker Thraben Watcher and add a counter to with Forge of Heroes, which felt awesome. Tikasia's Dig Site makes it colorless and has 3 in tap, Surveil 1. Prismatic Strands, Marshalling Cry, and Pilgrim of Ages are the only cards that benefit from being put into the graveyard, which can matter, but this is mostly in the deck to filter the top card of your deck, and it's mostly free because we don't run very many colorless sources. In fact, this is the 3rd and final colorless land, which I know people are going to have an issue with. The rest of the 30 lands in the deck are plains. I've been told by many people that I should get greedier with the mana base, but I believe that the benefits of those cards are negligible when compared to just entering untapped and producing colored mana. How all of this comes together is a mid-range deck that develops its board quickly turns 1 through 5, and then starts holding up interaction and protection for the rest of the game while slowly accumulating advantage. While it's capable of overpowering one player fairly early if it makes a concerted effort, Doing so usually drains resources too quickly, so it should be avoided. An issue with this deck is that aggressive decks see that we're scaling better than them and try to eliminate us first, even over combo players. Their logic being that they have interaction or hope that the table has interaction for the combo, but we're the visible threat that must be dealt with immediately because our deck develops consistently and visibly in a way that is difficult for them to deal with. I try to offer aggro players like this a deal early on to team up against the combo player to both buy time to get into the phase of the game where our deck is stronger and eliminate the need to worry about combo, but they don't always take the deal, which you have to be prepared for. If you have not had the conversation, assume that the combo player will get a free pass because players think that the combo decks will be easy to attack later on because of how their boards develop. The way I deal with this is to still focus my efforts on eliminating the combo player if possible. Allow through as much damage from the player attacking you as you feel comfortable doing, and try not to fight. Many aggro decks will stop attacking you if you let your life total drop below the other players, which is where our life gain helps out. Additionally, if we don't trade away our creatures, they'll generate more value later on when we have Anthems, +1/+1 counters, and have already got a few extra attacks in. I'm not sure if players still gunning for us means that we've failed our goal to be less threatening than Lulu, but I still love Thraben Watcher. If you'd like to see it played, there are links to some edited and narrated gameplay videos in the description. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Patreon shoutout to Achu, Hive Cryptid, and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you. When I need players for my Monday Pauper Commander streams, I use the Looking for Group channel on the Common Connoisseurs Discord to find additional players. It's free to join, and even if you don't plan to find games there, I still recommend joining. It's just a great place to talk about competitive Pauper Commander.